Welcome back everyone. So our game is really coming along nicely now. All that's left to do is the audio and add some music. So we can of course create our own sounds and music. A great software to make sound effects, for example, is Audacity, which you can download for free for both Windows and Mac over at audacity.org. And a neat tool to quickly and easily make your own music and soundtracks is called Bosca Seoil. Like Audacity, it's free and pretty awesome, but making sound effects and music is beyond the scope of this beginner course on making games. So instead, we're just going to download some cool sound effects and a music from different websites and then implement those inside of our project. A great place to search for free sound effects is called freesounds.org. This website is filled to the brim with SFX and musics. Just type what you're searching for here, listen to the audio clips, and then left click on one that you like to download it. You can also go to the YouTube audio library, which has sound effects and a ton of musics. So I'm going to make a small list of what I need to really bring my game to life. So first of all, I need an explosion sound effect for when a hazard destroys itself, then a sound effect for when the player is hurt, one for when he loses, and lastly I'll search for some cool music to play in the background. Of course, add as many or as little sound effects as you like. You might not think it necessary to have a SFX for when the player gets hit by a hazard, or you might want some footstep sounds. That's completely up to you. Anyway, I'll save my sound effects inside of a folder in my Unity project called Audio. Now I'll select my explosion prefab and add a new component to it called Audio Source. This is what will enable us to play sounds and musics. First of all, we have the actual clip, so I'm going to drag and drop my explosion sound inside of that empty slot. Here I can choose whether this explosion sound plays as soon as this explosion prefab is instantiated in the game world. In this case I'm going to leave this checked because I indeed want my sounds to play as soon as the effect is spawned. Another important setting is this loop one. This decides whether we want the explosion sounds to play over and over again or not. I obviously don't want this explosion to loop forever, so I'll leave it unchecked. But for a music, for example, having this loop box checked will come in very handy, because this way once the music is over it will repeat itself. Volume is pretty self-explanatory. It dictates how loud or low the explosion will sound, and this pitch slider controls the squeakiness of the sound. So a low value will make it more deep, and a high value more high-pitched and squeaky. As for this priority slider, it dictates how important this sound is as opposed to others in the same scene. A value of 0 gives it the most priority. Basically it will be heard first if two sounds play at the same time, for example, and a high value like 256 means it has a very low priority. So yeah, just play around with these settings a bit, and then press play to test things out. As expected, the explosion sound now plays whenever an explosion particle effect is spawned in-game, because there's that audio source component attached to it. Note that if you don't hear any audio at all, make sure that this mute audio button isn't active. Now let's add a sound for when the player gets hurt. I'll select the player and add an audio source component to him, and I'll add to that my player hurt sound effect. I'll now hit play. Indeed hear that hurt sound effect as soon as the game starts, but that's not really what we want. We need to type some simple code to get our sound effect playing at the right time, in this case when the player takes damage. So I'll uncheck play on awake since we don't want the sound playing as soon as the game starts, and then open up my player script and create up here a private variable of type audio source called source. And like we did for both the animator and 2D rigid body, I'll type source equals getComponent audio source. This way we can use via code anything related to the audio source component. And now in the take damage function, I'll type source.play. And that's it. Now the hurt sound will play as soon as the player takes damage. Let's test this out. And indeed it works smoothly. Lastly, I'll select my lose panel, add an audio source component to that, and drag and drop my game over sound inside of that empty slot. This way when the lose panel gets activated, the sound will play since play on awake is checked. And that's about it for sound effects. I must admit though that having the same explosion sound effects being played every single time is a little boring, so let's change that. I've gone ahead and downloaded 3 more, and now let's play a random one via script. So I'll create a new C# script called random sound, open the explosion prefab and add that random sound script to it. And now I'll open it up inside of Visual Studio. I'll start by making an audio source variable again called source and setting it equal to getComponent audio source in the start function. And then I'll make an array of type audio clip called sounds. We'll be storing in this array all of our explosion sounds, and now I'll make an int variable in the start function called random sounds and set it equal to a random number between 0 and the number of elements inside of this sounds array. So we'll have 4 sounds in this array. As a result, this random sounds variable will be equal to a random number between 0 and 3. Because remember, the last number isn't included. And now I'll set my audio source's sound clip to be equal to a random sound using that random sound variable we just generated up here. And lastly, play that sound by typing source.play. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Again, with time and patience, you'll slowly come to understand this programming language, which I assure you was once completely alien for me too. Anyway, I'll head back to Unity, and here's a neat trick. I'll lock the inspector by clicking on this small padlock icon, and then shift select all my explosion sounds and drag and drop them inside of that sounds array. This will automatically add them all to the array, which is faster than manually doing so, especially if your array is supposed to be made up of dozens of objects. And now I'll hit play, and yeah, the game sounds a lot better with different explosion sounds being played. Okay, before wrapping up this video, I'll head over to the main menu, create a new empty game object called music, and drag and drop the music I chose in the inspector. Note that doing so automatically adds an audio source component to the object. I'll check loop so that the music repeats itself once complete. Now I'll press play, and indeed the music starts playing. I'll then hit the game's play button, and as soon as we transition to the game scene, the music stops. This is because there's no longer that music game object. We need to find some way to keep that music game object with us from scene to scene. This way the music doesn't just stop. Now you can of course simply have one music for the main menu and one for the game scene, in which case creating a game object with an audio source component and 2 different musics for each scene is fine, but I think it's cool to have a continuous soundtrack being played throughout the whole game. You can keep the player nicely immersed in the world. So to do so, I'll create another C# script called Music Manager and drag and drop that onto my music game object. I'll create a private static music manager variable called instance, then inside of a function called awake, which is basically called just once as soon as the game starts, even before the start function. I'll type if instance is equal to null, then instance is equal to this. And I'll type don't destroy on load instance. If not, then I'll simply destroy the game object. Now of course, don't worry if you have absolutely no clue what's going on here. It's some pretty advanced code, and you'll learn more about these concepts later in your game dev journey. For now, just know that this will make sure that the object that has this code attached to it will maintain itself between scenes. Anyway, I'll now hit play and press play here. And now the music continues smoothly because our music object isn't destroying itself between scenes. Great, and that will mark the end of this video. The game, for me anyway, is complete. As I said before, you can add more to it now if you want, or change some of the art or effects or sounds. Get creative, have fun, and when you finished your first game using Unity, join me in the next video where we'll learn how to publish it on a website called itch.io, so others like me and Liam, other students, family and friends can play your game. Okay, cheers.